morning in 1918, a crazy hope caught the hearts of mankind. On the devastated earth, the ruined towns, the millions of soldiers in the mud from the Argonne to the Champagne, the fire slowly lifted, and the guns fell silent. 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, 1918. This is the story of the years that followed, the mad 20s, years of scandal, gaiety, and pleasure, years of folly with an aftertaste of blood. Above all, years of illusion when the world fooled itself shamelessly. For the first few months, nothing was too good for the war heroes. France's leaders showered praise on the returning soldiers. And the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were restored to their French motherland. Paris was saved, and her children fought the war all over again. But there were thousands of children whose fathers did not return. Thousands of men who would never see again in this merciless new century which forces even the maimed to move fast. Despite the harsh realities of victory, there is still room for the heroic legend. The unknown soldier is laid to rest. Ravaging whole populations, an epidemic of Spanish flu swept Europe. And Paris was gripped by another outbreak as well, a wave of nostalgia for the good old pre-war times. Gradually, the shadow of the war disappeared. Fortifications were taken down, and people tried to recapture the leisurely flavor of life as it had been before that fatal summer of 1914. Manners had changed. In this brassy post-war world, you didn't ask for what you wanted, you just took it. In the most elegant restaurant in Paris, Maxime's, some of the old-timers tried to preserve the graces and gallantries of French tradition. But now they had resentful critics and rivals, the new rich families who had made money out of the war and would stay up all night to spend it. In fact, it was pretty square in the 20s to go home before breakfast time. Like everywhere else, the establishment was losing its power in France. Wealthy old families, les grandes familles, were no longer the dictators of society. Daughters married men whose pedigrees scandalized many a noble maman. But history was in a hurry, and in January 1919 it kept a rendezvous at Versailles with three men. Clemenceau, obstinate, implacable, and tough. Lloyd George, the victim of his own subtlety. President Wilson, offering the world an idealistic peace plan. The defeated Germans accepted the Allies' conditions, and in the Hall of Mirrors, on the 28th of June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, creating the League of Nations. But before the ink was dry, the nations were forging a different destiny. When the treaty was signed, the Russian Revolution was already 2 years old, a red rock towering on the threshold of the 20th century. Military defeats and the sufferings of the war had undermined the empire of the Tsars. In February 1917, it collapsed. The socialist leader Kerensky formed a provisional government which carried on the war. But a wave of pacifism engulfed the Russian armies. Russian and German troops left their trenches and fraternized. Fighting ceased, and the Russians abandoned the Eastern Front. Crowds paraded the cities demanding peace. In July 1917, police opened fire on demonstrators in Petrograd, killing many. Revolutionary workers answered this massacre by forming the Red Guard. On November the 7th, the Bolsheviks attacked the Tsar's Winter Palace, arrested Kerensky's government, and took over power. Within 3 months, the Bolsheviks made peace with the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. The treaty was signed by Leon Trotsky, founder of the Red Army. Lenin ruled in the name of communism. But General Wrangel led officers of the old regime in a bloody civil war which lasted 4 years. Finally, the Red Army attacked on all fronts and won. Communism had arrived, and it had spread to Germany. The miracle of radio, fashioned by Marconi, brought organized entertainment into the home for the first time. And other adventurers of the air made flying a fine art. The first Paris to London air service was inaugurated, and inventors worked hard to improve it. The next innovation in the age of speed was the scooter. Its manufacturer was told it would never last, and he gave up making them. The motor car, formerly a rich man's toy, chugged into everyday life. Henry Ford made them cheaper still. And the eternal passion for excitement was fed by motor racing. Some inventors said petrol was too expensive and made cars that ran on air. Strange this never caught on. The roads were still very rough, so a car had to be pretty versatile. The new machines made Babylonian fortunes for the men who controlled them. Henry Ford and Rockefeller, the family man. Rockefeller, the traveler. And Rockefeller, the disciple of fitness. But while America tasted prosperity, other nations hungered for independence. Ireland, led by Eamon de Valera, struck at British rule for the 7th time in 300 years. Pilsudski became dictator of Poland. Beneš, statesman of the new democracy of Czechoslovakia. Kemal Atatürk, pushing feudal Turkey into the modern world. In Italy, discontented workers took over the factories. The fascists took advantage of these outbreaks, and in 1922, Mussolini's black shirts marched on Rome. Mussolini murdered many of his opponents, including the socialist Matteotti. And millions more were to die before fascism was defeated. The Russian Revolution seemed to be foundering. The economy was totally disorganized. Famine was rife, and the shadow of death hung over 20 million people. Lenin tried to abolish religion, which he called the opium of the masses. Monks and clergy were arrested and tried. In 1924, Lenin himself died. And the Red Army waited to know his successor. While Russia mourned, the Kremlin leaders maneuvered till one man rose out of the struggle and changed the balance of the world. Germany was rising too. She haughtily refused to pay her war debts, so French troops occupied the Ruhr, where they quickly endeared themselves to the locals. But the Germans were building another powerful army under the same generals who had fought for the exiled Kaiser. Then Germany, under the socialist banner of the Weimar Republic, entered the League of Nations, pursuing justice and peace. The defeat of Stanley Baldwin and Winston Churchill gave socialism its first chance to govern England under Ramsay MacDonald. France listened to Léon Blum and voted for the left as well. But immediately France was plunged into a vicious war in Morocco against the Rif rebels. Even then, North Africa was a troublesome cuckoo in the French nest. However, Paris had never had it so good. Everyone, everywhere who made money wanted to spend it in France, or his wife did. Tourists flocked in from every country on earth, and it wasn't hard to recognize the Americans. There was plenty to see, particularly a new phenomenon called the flapper. She was the epitome of the 20s, and for some obscure reason, millions of us are still in love with her and her gay ways. She encouraged her sisters to smoke and play cards. To master the deadly elements. To fly in the face of nature. And to think things out for themselves. There was nothing a man could do that a flapper couldn't do better. The gigolo, practitioner of an ancient art, and some would say a useful one. In general, though, the male of the 20s didn't know where he was. Overnight, it seemed he had lost millions of years of mastery. Professor Voronoff and his monkey glands offered new vistas of possibility to chaps who wished to enjoy these social changes, but had imagined themselves rather past it. But the best way of catching a man was to dress for him. In 1925, a cyclone called Chanel swept through the salons of high fashion and produced the fabulous look that stamped the 20s in our memories. The word chic was born. These ladies, in their time, were solemnly considered to be the cream of chic. Chic was elegance. Cars could be elegant, and Paris gave prizes for the smartest ones. Nevertheless, there was a strong resistance against chic, and some of the wisest folk in France said it wouldn't last. In 1925, the chic thing was to learn the Charleston. The 20s said what they had to say in dancing, which was a rage in all its forms. Isadora Duncan gave dancing a whole new meaning. But perhaps the Charleston gave it even more. It became the anthem of the age of pleasure. Paris enthusiastically accepted the new institution of the companionable weekend. Getting out of town was just as simple in the 20s. The prototype of the Sunday driver appeared. And a Sunday in the country in 1926 was much the same as it is nowadays. The 20s were the golden years of sport. Country after country revived the Roman idea of the stadium. And fans revived the Roman way of getting in. Sunday after Sunday, they came to see their idols. Nurmi, the flying Finn with the world at his feet. The six-day bicycle race. The Tour de France. King Gustav of Sweden, playing against the legendary Suzanne Lenglen. Charles Rigoleau, the strongest man in the world. Jack Dempsey, winner of the fight of the century against Georges Carpentier, the best-looking loser who ever charmed the women. And irreverently satirizing the muscle cult, the champion of the French music hall, Maurice Chevalier. Chevalier's friend of the time, Miss Tanguette, darling of Paris, cultivating chic in a riding kit of unborn calf. Nobody, not even in Broadway, could put on a show like Paris. They perfected the large-scale review, starring Josephine Baker. The rival art of the cinema was finding its voice. A whole new hierarchy of screen idols emerged. Harold Lloyd, Fatty Arbuckle, Jackie Coogan, the Kid. Dominating them all in the frenzy of his followers was Rudolph Valentino, the Sheikh himself. When he died, 90,000 women wept by his coffin. Somehow, this young actor, killed by peritonitis at the age of 31, had touched their secret yearnings. But all the time, the movies were growing up. New techniques made the great illusion greater, wrapping entertainers like the Dolly Sisters in a magical mist of glamour. Sometimes these techniques were perverted to serve sensationalism and stunts. the movie cameras moved on to do a prouder job, recording the living face of history. It took them to China in 1927. The warlords of the North were defending their medieval society against the modern bayonets of Sun Yat-sen's philosophy and the cannon of the Kuomintang. A war of ideas, they said, but the ideas were buried in butchery. Victoria's armies turned on each other, and fighting spread to Canton and Shanghai. Europeans began to leave. British, American, and French troops patrolled the international concessions. And here again, the French had a certain je ne sais quoi. There were 500 million Chinese, and it seemed most of them were trying to loot the deserted banks. China's neighbor in the east, India, raised a national hero, Gandhi. India too wanted independence, but he guided her towards it in a different way, passive resistance. The tactics of today's nuclear disarmers had their roots in the Indian protests of the 20s. Far away in America, another national hero was waiting. Young Charles Lindbergh had begun a non-violent attempt against the final force of all, nature itself. Loaded with every last pint of petrol he could carry, he took off across the Atlantic, while the world waited. "33 hours later, he landed at Le Bourget. Paris went hysterical, and so did New York. Broadway businessmen worked off their emotions over Lindbergh by throwing ticker tape. But Paris businessmen relaxed in more exotic ways at more obliging establishments. The ones with the money danced on. But the mad dance of the millions was going into its last chorus. Russia was making a giant effort to struggle up from chaos, and it was succeeding. Two little-known officials came to inspect a new dam. They were Bulganin and Khrushchev. Khrushchev's scientific triumphs were still a long way off, but French engineers were challenging the world. The Ile-de-France was designed to rule the ocean, and Germany was determined to master the air. Never again will travel be the thrill it was in the 20s, that incomparable first sight of New York, the mightiest partnership yet between man and materialism. But the city's riches were built on strange foundations. Underlying America's success story was an odd pattern of guilt, fear, and frustration. She went through the astonishing charade of prohibition, which prevented practically nobody from getting a drink. The bootleggers who supplied the illegal liquor became millionaires, even more powerful than the legitimate ones. The city of Chicago was controlled by men like Al Capone and John Dillinger. In the name of patriotism, another force was at work, the Ku Klux Klan, preaching religious and racial hatred. The anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti were executed after 7 years of waiting, and the world protested. On the 24th of October, 1929, all America's illusions exploded in her face. The United States was hurled from incredible wealth to dazed poverty in a single afternoon. They called the financial oracles together, Firestone, Wright, Edison, Ford, Eastman, and they asked, what are we going to do? But the oracles had no answer. The unemployed marched to Washington, and ruined bankers sold apples in the streets.
And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
The Puritan streak in America made her examine her conscience. And President Hoover announced that prosperity is just around the corner. It was not. Around the corner was world unemployment. Further bank collapses. And a rising flood of communism in Germany. Red Front whipped the German unemployed into riots and demonstrations. The Nazis saw their excuse and their opportunity. In the flames of the Reichstag, supposed to have been fired by the mad youth van der Lubbe, in the flames of the bonfires that consumed the world's greatest books, in the fiery glow of the World War that nothing could now prevent, in this funeral pyre of hope and decency, you could hear for a little while longer the music of the Charleston that will last for all time as the theme of the mad, lost 20s.